The Starfleet life with the USS Dauntless. Are you brave enough to be a Starfleet officer? Do you have what it takes? Greetings. I am Admiral Swart, Commanding Officer of the USS Dauntless, and this is the briefing with the Admiral for Stardate -25-1262.1. I am the Admiral in question, and today we're going to be talking about the 3 pillars of mission readiness. But before we get to any of that, just got a little bit of housekeeping, and that is to say that we record these sessions on Tuesdays at 12:30 South African Standard Time. We try to do it every week, but it doesn't always work out. If you are an active duty member of the Dauntless crew, you're welcome to join us live for these recording sessions in Discord in the Screening Room channel, in which you can then participate in the live chat. If you are not an active duty member of the Dauntless crew, you can join us on YouTube. I'm able to sometimes monitor the chat in YouTube, but it doesn't seem to be working today. So best of luck if you are on YouTube. Hopefully I can check your comments or questions later. And that means that you'll be joining everybody else who might want to watch these after the fact, because middle of the day on a Tuesday is admittedly an awkward time. So we don't expect anybody to actually be present for these. It's a bonus if you're here. And if you are one of those people, please feel free to drop a comment either on YouTube or on Facebook, where this will be uploaded after the fact. Or if you'd like to reach out to me privately, you're welcome to do so using just about any communication system known to exist, except for the bad ones, which is basically WhatsApp and Signal. All right, so if you have a question or a comment, please make sure that you get that through to me if you're in the live chat. So if you're here in Discord and you're an active duty member of the crew and you want to make sure that I see your comment or a question, because I'll be going back at the end of the Q&A section to see if there are any questions or comments directed at me, please make sure that you @tag me, you mention me in your comment or question so that I see your response. So then it's highlighted and it comes up on my screen and I can see it. Otherwise I might miss it because the chat is often fairly lively during these sessions and I don't get to scroll back through all of the comments and questions until after the fact. So if you want to make sure that I see your comment or question, please make sure that you @tag me, and I will do my best to address it there and then. Or if I can't do it then I might use it as fuel to generate future briefing topics, which would be great. But who am I and why am I here? So I am the commanding officer of the USS Dauntless. As I mentioned, the Dauntless is a future-focused advocacy and action group that has a special interest in Star Trek. We are at our core a Star Trek fan group. We are a chapter of Starfleet, the International Star Trek Fan Association Incorporated, which is the single largest organized Star Trek fan organization in the world. We have Starfleet International, that is, has thousands of members in hundreds of chapters in dozens of countries around the world, and the Dauntless is one of those. We are the chapter based in Cape Town, South Africa, but we're an online group. We're an organization that lives in the present and in the future. And so a lot of our activities are coordinated online, principally here on Discord. So we are not limited only to Cape Town. We have members all over the place. So if you are the kind of person who thinks like you would fit in on the Dauntless, you'd like to be one of our leading elite members of Starfleet, then you're welcome to sign up. That would be great. All right, but let's get on with today's topic, which is the 3 pillars of mission readiness. So today's topic came to me when I was watching ahead on our daily devotionals. So in case you haven't been keeping track, Daily Devotional is a project that we use here on the Dauntless to study the Star Trek canon. So the Star Trek canon is a colossal body of work, close to or possibly even over already 1,000 episodes and feature films. So there's no correct way of approaching all of these things. We've been produced more or less continuously for almost 60 years now. Hundreds and hundreds of episodes to watch. So in order to make any kind of sense about this, I have sequenced the entire canon into chronological sequence, and then we watch together or study together an episode per day. in chronological sequence from beginning all the way to the end, and then back to the beginning again. This is a personal project that I share with the Dauntless crew, and it is something that I feel very strongly about. It's quite important that we, as Star Trek fans who are drawing inspiration from the Star Trek canon to bring about change in the world, that we touch back with our original source material, the place where we derive our inspiration and our ideology from, our framework and our philosophy. We need to be touching back with that often, preferably every day, to remind ourselves why we're doing this, why it's important, and why it matters. So an episode a day is the way we do that. And then we have an automated bot that posts the name and description of the episode each day in a channel here in our Discord server, in the Future History channel. And then we are invited to have a discussion about the episode. And I try to make sure that I write something about every episode every day if I possibly can. But it's not always practical to watch an episode every single day. Sometimes life happens and then you fall behind. Or if you've got a little bit of extra capacity, maybe you can watch ahead a few episodes. And that's what I've been doing the last few days. I've been watching ahead. So in the next couple of days, the episode that will be coming up is from the animated series, and it's an episode called BEM, in which we are introduced to the fictional species called Pandronians. And Pandronians are what's called a colony species. Let me show you what they look like. So what's interesting about Pandronians is that even though they look vaguely humanoid, in other words, they kind of sort of look like people, they're different in one important way, and that is that their bodies don't consist of one single body. They are a colony of distinct organisms, at least half a dozen different organisms that kind of work together. So you can see here's an example of a Pandronian. This is Bem himself, after which the episode is named, and he has separated himself into 3 component parts. You see his head floating there, his torso, arms and hands are floating there, and his waist and legs and feet are on the ground there. The floating thing, it's unclear whether that's a natural ability or if that's somehow derived from technology. I'm going to go with a technological thing, that they've got some kind of little suspensor lift anti-gravity device that allows them to allow their different bodily components to float around like that, which is the thing that exists in the Star Trek universe. It's not that weird. But the ability to separate is what's interesting. And what continues to be interesting is that these different body parts, even when they are separated from each other in this way, they still consider themselves a single individual. But their sense of self, their sense of individuality comes not from the physical cohesion, but from the combination of the parts. This particular assembly, this particular version of me that is made up of these different parts, that's me. That's Bem. We saw another Pandronian later, Sharian Yem, we came across later in Lower Decks, and she spoke about herself in a very similar way. And here's another image where you can see Bem has separated his upper body. So there's his torso and his arm, and there's his lower body, his abdomen and legs. And his legs have actually sprouted 2 extra little arms that he can use to do stuff with, right? So these different parts of his body are capable of operating independent of one another, but still coordinated with each other. They have a remote access situation where he can remote control parts of his body. And it got me thinking when I was doing my write-up about this, about the notion of self and how the different components of a living being contribute to what it is that makes you a self. Now, our traditional way of thinking about that, at least with humans in human bodies, is that our self comes from our brain, from our mind, right? The brain is the substrate where your mind happens, and therefore that's where your sense of self must come from. And we see this echoed in a lot of sort of futuristic thinking, what's the word, transhumanism, and a lot of science fiction, when we're talking about the notion of mind transfer or brain transplant, where the idea that you transplant your brain into a new body and then it wakes up in the new body and it's still the same old you, even though your physical body has changed. But a lot of new thinking in neurobiology sets that up as probably not accurate, that the rest of the body contributes to your sense of self in a way that is not necessarily predictable. or that we wouldn't necessarily have anticipated, but are just as important. Even things like not just your nervous system, which you might expect that being an extension of your brain, but also things like your musculature, your gut microbiome, all of these kinds of things that happen elsewhere in your body contribute as much to your sense of self, to your emotional state, to your physical continuity as stuff that's happening in your brain does. And so this notion of a personality transplant or a brain transplant may be not a viable concept, simply because your sense of self is much more widespread than we are accustomed to thinking. So when I was thinking about that, I was reminded of our ideological commitment to the notion of mission readiness, which is something that happens here on the Dauntless. This is one of our guiding philosophies. And okay, we can take the Pandronian off. We're kind of done with that for now. So here on the Dauntless, we practice a discipline called mission readiness, which is the notion of continuous self-improvement, doing what we can to improve ourselves, to become a better version of ourselves today than we were yesterday, and then a better version still tomorrow. And we think of this ideology, philosophy, discipline, that's the right word. We think of this discipline in terms of three distinct but overlapping pillars, and that is physical, mental, and emotional. And I'm always saying that those things are really not different. They're all parts of the same system, but it's useful practically to think about them being different. So let's go into a bit more detail about all of that. So right, so we talk about readiness in terms of these three pillars: physical, mental, and emotional. But that's really only a practical distinction, right? It's like putting labels on different stations of the ship, right? You think of the starship bridge, and you've got all these different control consoles, and they're all linked together, right? They're all linked to one giant system, which is the starship. But it's useful to split those functions out to different stations so that different people can operate them, because those different people have different practical focuses, but they're all using the same machine, right? It's all part of one big system. So let's think of those three pillars as being three different consoles or three different interfaces into managing your mission readiness, your self-improvement mission, your ongoing quest of self-improvement. So the physical interface is like, what does that look like? It's like finishing a long hike without giving up. Your mental side is holding your head clear while you're busy taking a test, or while you conducting a briefing like this or something like that. And then emotional readiness is things like keeping your cool when unexpected things happen. Keeping a lid on your emotions and not allowing them to interfere with your day-to-day operations. But as I said, we don't actually have three pillars, right? These things are not distinct. They're not separate from one another. They're part of the same system. They're part of the same ship. We have one pursuit that's just viewed through these three different interfaces, right? We have three different ways of accessing the same machine. So let's look a little bit deeper back into the Pandronian idea, right? So why was I inspired by this to talk about this today? Pandronians are described as being colony organisms. Now, colony organisms as we know them here on Earth are a little bit different to what the Pandronians are. So we're talking about things like corals or brittle stars and things like that, where you typically have a bunch of tiny little individual organisms, usually animals, that are usually genetically identical to each other. They're typically clones of one another, and they kind of link together to form one large structure. Sometimes they'll be specialized. So some of the animals in the organism will do this part of what it means to be alive. They'll kind of function as one big organism, but they are technically biologically distinct animals. Each one is a separate animal. They're dependent on each other, sort of symbiotically. This is kind of a form of symbiosis, but it's symbiosis between multiple individuals, and they are physically fused together. So think of something that is even more cohesive than a beehive or an ant nest or something like that, an ant colony. It's even more tightly woven than that, right? So a coral or a brittle star would be something like that, where you've got lots of little polyps that are physically attached to one another and they form part of this one singular organism. Now, the Pendronians aren't quite like that. So we saw that Bem had multiple different parts of his body that all consist, they're all part of the same body, right? But when they're split out, they're quite different. So his head was one component, his torso was one component, his hands were separate, his legs were separate. I think we saw his feet physically separate from his body at one point. So a dozen, at least, different distinct organisms all joined together into this one thing, but they are all highly specialized. So the head presumably is where most of his thinking happens, because that's where his brain would be. His hands obviously are capable of gripping in a way that his elbows aren't. His torso probably is involved in things like digestion and the circulatory system and that kind of thing, although each separate nodule would need to have a component of those kinds of functionality included in them. They would need to have, he'd need to have a little remote heart and a little set of remote lungs in his head, so that when his head is detached from the rest of the colony, it can still function on its own. But presumably it wouldn't be able to function separately like that indefinitely. It would need to reconnect in order to replenish with its other resources from time to time. They don't really go into that much detail in the episode, but we can infer a lot based on what we observe. So this is how the Pendronians are different from colony organisms that we know here on Earth, right? So Bem looks like one being, and he thinks of himself as being one being. He considers himself one being, but he's really a collection of these parts. So in that way, he resembles those colony organisms that we know here, like corals and brittle stars. Or a Portuguese man of war. That's another good example. But unlike those, his parts can move and act independently. His head speaks and it plans and it identifies itself as I, and the rest of his body seems to provide scaffolding, as it were. So locomotion and manipulation of his environment. But if you swap those parts out, they're not. Firstly, they're not interchangeable, right? But also, he speaks at the end of the episode, having done something bad, right? He did something, I'm not going to go into too many spoilers, but he did something bad, and we're told that he's going to be punished. And part of his punishment is that he is going to be disassembled. So his different component parts are going to be taken apart, and they're going to be reconstituted into other new individuals. And he laments that to him, this feels like a death, because this particular assemblage of parts will no longer be reconstituted in this form anymore. It will not, those parts will be farmed out to other individual selves, and this self, this Bem being, will cease to exist. So even though his head might be attached to a different assembly of individual parts, that assembly will no longer be Bem. It'll no longer be him. It'll feel like something different. So we would imagine that his sense of self comes from his head, but really his sense of self comes from the whole assembly. The whole colony is Bem, not just his head. So we can't swap out the parts and still have him retain his sense of self, even though his sense of identity exists principally in his brain, in his head. So he suffers therefore what is an existential risk. So this is similar to other quandaries that we see in canon, things like Tuvix. So his fear is that his parts are reassembled differently, then he will cease to exist, and he'll be a new person, or multiple new people, new selves that are not Bem. So he sees that as the end of his existence in that form. So it's the same risk that we face when our own parts, like our physical and mental and emotional parts, drift out of alignment, right? So if those three aspects of ourselves are too out of whack, then we face an existential threat as well, because that means that the rest of the system can collapse and we lose our sense of center and our sense of self. So the question is, what is your head? So Bem's head, what is your head, right? In terms of your mission readiness objective, your mission readiness ideal. Which interface do you lean on most when it comes to your sense of self and your sense of identity? And how stable is that aspect of yourself without the others, right? How much can you retain your sense of self without that scaffolding of the rest of the parts of yourself? I'll leave you with that question. I'm not going to answer it for you. But we can talk about the biological basis of that interconnection, right? So when I say that those three pillars of mission readiness are intrinsically interconnected, I don't just mean sort of philosophically or ideologically. I mean in a very physical, practical sense, in a chemical sense, in a visceral sense, right? So what does that mean? Well, let's look at them at each one as a different example. So from the physical point of view, right? So how is physical connected and how does it influence your mental and emotional aspects? The one that I keep harping on is cardiovascular system, right? So your blood flow to your brain, which is improved and becomes more efficient the more physically strong you become, right? The fitter you become, the stronger you get, the more you improve blood flow to the brain, which is where most of your cognition and subjective experience, subjective experience takes place, resides seated in the brain. The better your blood flow to the brain, especially when you're busy exercising, it actually improves your ability to retain and access memories. It helps your ability to focus on tasks. So that's your intellectual side of things. It helps to regulate the flow of neurotransmitters when you're exerting yourself physically, right? Especially when you exercise, which helps to stabilize your mood and helps to reduce anxiety, right? Especially cortisol. Cortisol is very important for your day-to-day functioning. You need that for your cognitive development. But when we exist in a state of anxiety, your cortisol levels get too high, and that can start to have negative effects on your cognition long term. But being physically fit, especially cardiovascular fit, but just generally speaking, having higher muscle mass than normal, that helps you to regulate your cortisol. So when your cortisol goes up, your body responds appropriately. And then when you no longer need that cortisol is then reabsorbed and then it goes away, right? You don't need it all the time. So that sense of anxiety goes away. Getting strong, getting fit actually helps you to regulate your cortisol, which helps to manage symptoms of anxiety. So cortisol regulation through training eases your emotional volatility. Okay, what about the next one? What about focusing on your mental readiness? How does that affect your physical or emotional legs for interfaces? Pillars, that's the word. So your cognitive discipline, when you're working on building your cognitive discipline, it helps to improve things like your fine motor skills and coordination. And this is where, in terms of practical doing stuff, what can you do to build this specific form of cognitive discipline? Painting miniatures. Warhammer miniatures is probably a great way of doing exactly this, because you're kind of wagging the tail by the dog. You're working on your dexterity, your fine motor skills, because you have to get those details very, very precise. By forcing yourself to do that, you're helping to build your cognitive discipline, which then flows into other arenas of life, right? So you're building up that muscle, that cognitive discipline. But cognitive discipline doesn't only come from fine motor skills, right? That's just one sort of implementation of it. The most important form of cognitive discipline is getting yourself to do stuff that's difficult, right? That's the most important thing, because that unlocks other things, right? So it allows you to appraise your level of stress by no longer being stressed out by the notion of doing something difficult, right? So you anticipate doing something difficult, but you are disciplined enough to get yourself through it. You're not anticipating, okay, I've taken too many steps. Let me take a step back. A lot of your mental or cognitive load is taken up by simulating or anticipating things that are coming up in the near future, right? As human brains, that's what a lot of our resources are being spent on, anticipating what's coming up, running simulations on how to do that thing, so that when we get to actually do the task, we know how to do it optimally, right? We've already simulated the task in multiple different outcomes, and we have a fair sense of how we're going to engage with that task. We're spending a lot of resources on doing that. If you're doing that in a way that a lot of those simulations are not yielding a positive outcome, right? In other words, you can't clearly see a good solution to how you're going to perform that task. That is where anxiety comes from. That's where you start to feel anxious, because you're anticipating a negative outcome from a future event. And that's when your cortisol starts to go up. But if your cortisol is under control, you can remain calm long enough that you're not running multiple extra cycles. You can start thinking more clearly about how to derive a positive outcome from that future action, which means that your ability to regulate your stress allows you to perform more successful simulations. And then when you get to the actual thing, when the time comes to do the task, you can do so with more confidence, because you've run more simulations in your head with a positive outcome. You have a better idea of how to actually do the thing. It reduces your cognitive load. So you see these anticipated future actions as a challenge, something that you could overcome, something that you trust that you can complete. You have confidence in your actions and in your abilities, rather than a threat, rather than a negative outcome that can potentially harm you in some way. So those mental routines, especially when you have your cortisol under control, they can help you to do things like enforce your sleep regularity, which helps you to regulate your emotions and your cognitive cycles and your physical recovery. It helps you to manage your nutrition because you're not doing things like inattentive eating or stress eating. And it helps to manage your recovery because you're more aware of what your body is doing, what you're going through. You can take note of and process your sensory inputs from inside your body, and you can manage your recovery appropriately. So this is how your mental focus affects your physical and emotional sides of things too. And then what about your emotional state? How does that affect your physical and mental pillars, right? So chronic stress, which is what you get from having consistently high cortisol levels, suppresses your immune system, so it makes you vulnerable to disease, and it disrupts your other hormones, right? Because cortisol is a hormone, right? It's one of multiple hormones, but it stimulates the production of other hormones, and you get your hormones all out of whack, and then bad things start to happen long term if that is a chronic state. So if you're able to manage your chronic stress, in other words, your cortisol and adrenaline levels, then that helps to stabilize the rest of your system and allows you to devote more resources day to day to managing your immune system to help you fight off potential infection. That anxiety consumes cognitive bandwidth. Again, I was talking about running those simulations and how when you anticipate negative outcomes, that drives up your stress levels. And then you run more simulations and you run more simulations, and it becomes a feedback loop and it becomes very stressful. That means you are left with little room for clarity, right? Because you're so busy worrying about those negative outcomes that you don't have the mental bandwidth to sit back and actually think through the solutions, and also to contextualize the situation, right? Because the simulations you're running for the situation that you're likely to encounter may not be something big or important, right? It might be a relatively minor interaction, like a friendly conversation with somebody that you know, like with a colleague or something like that. And if you flub it, right? If you embarrass yourself, if you say something stupid because you didn't anticipate it properly, what's the worst that can happen, right? Your friend has a little giggle and then you go on with your day. But if you're feeling anxious about it and you run simulation after simulation and you start amping up that anxiety, you lose the ability to contextualize the stakes of that interaction, right? And you start to catastrophize and you start to think that embarrassing yourself in front of your colleague or your close friend might have drastically negative outcomes, which are almost certainly not going to happen. So it forces you, well, it doesn't force you, but it causes you to lose sight of the big picture and how each action in your life can impact the rest of your life, right? What context each action and each interaction and each scenario has within the big picture. So that stress, that anxiety causes you to lose focus and lose your contextual awareness. But emotional steadiness, if it's something that you can work towards, helps to sustain consistency in your everyday actions and all the things that you do, but it also allows you to devote your resources and time to things like physical training and studying to increase or to improve your skills, right? So the more emotionally stable you are, the more you are able to develop yourself physically and mentally, and then you can see how those things feed back on each other. So whenever you train one of these three interfaces, one of these three pillars, you are always training the others, right? They all feed off each other, whether you realize it or not. So let's talk about the illusion of separation, right? Let's just talk about that, right? So we talked about the interfaces metaphor, right? So you've got these three stations on the bridge, and the bridge is your control system for your entire body, your entire machine, but it's useful and practical to think of these three different interfaces, these three different stations through which you're able to interact with the whole machine. But the pillars are not real divisions, right? Those consoles are all connected to the same machine. They're like diagnostic panels, and they help us to see what's going on, but they're all part of the same system. So bringing this back to the Pandronian metaphor, a xenobiologist can study Bem's limbs or his torso separately, But that's not really all that useful, right? The reality is that BEM exists only when the parts are connected in the right way, right? So if you want to take them apart to its constituent pieces, studying each constituent piece is only going to give you some of the information. You really, in order to understand BEM, you need to assemble him in that particular configuration in order to really know what's going on. So think of it this way. If you strengthen one interface in isolation, so if you decide you're going to spend all of your resources on only strengthening your mental strength, right? You're only going to spend all of your time doing that. You're going to read books, you're going to gain skills, you're going to study hard, you're going to learn new languages, all that kind of stuff. That's all mental stuff. To the exclusion of the other two pillars. Now, we've already spoken about how developing one automatically influences the other. But let's say you want to spend all of your time, all of your available resources on only developing the one pillar. What is the effect that you might have noticed on the others? Now, this is something that I've certainly done, right? In my younger years, I was a snob about it. I thought that it was a good idea to develop only my intellectual self, and that emotional and physical pillars were irrelevant. They didn't matter, right? They weren't important. Developing a physical side was silly. It was vanity. It wasn't worth my time. And I was in complete denial about any kind of emotional work that needed to be done. I thought that intellectual work was the only work that mattered and everything else was silly. And it was not great, right? I didn't have great outcomes from that perspective. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but suffice to say, I have revised that position. So think about that for yourself, in your history, in your younger years. Has there ever been a time where you have decided to focus only on one of the three pillars to the exclusion of the other two? And what impact might that have had on your life when that was going on? You don't have to answer in the chat. Just think about it. Just run it over in your head. I want to introduce another analogy. So this is the limitation of human language, is that we don't get to address concepts directly because they're often too complex to address immediately. Even language itself is an abstraction. It's a metaphor. But fortunately, as storytelling organisms, our brains are optimized to be able to convey complex thoughts in terms of analogies and metaphors and ideas and images. So I'm going to appeal to yet another analogy in a way to try and tackle this concept perhaps from a different angle. I'm going to talk about us now as a crew, right? So distributed unity as a crew. So thinking again of BEM, so his parts of himself were able to separate from each other, and they were able to operate more or less independently. They were still being coordinated together. He had some kind of system that allowed him to remote control his different body parts. So they were acting in concert, but they were physically disconnected from each other. They were acting independently, but they were still acting as one, right? They're still one organism. They're still coordinating. They're still collaborating. So as long as they remained aligned, only the misalignment of those parts breaks the self. Only when he was threatened that those parts would be reconstituted into other individuals did that pose an existential threat to BEM, right? So working remotely, separately, but in concert with one another was fine, but that didn't break the self. It was only discontinuation that damaged the self of BEM. That's what gave him fear. That's what he was afraid of. And we can think of this as an analogy for a starship crew, right? Like us, we are a starship crew. And we can think of the different departments, like the limbs of the Pandronian, right? You've got the command department is perhaps the torso. You've got the communications department, might be the head. You've got the engineering department is the left arm. The science department is the right arm, and so on. And those departments act independently of one another, right? Each department has its own function, has its own job to do, has its own responsibilities. And we don't even necessarily collaborate with each other on projects, right? Sometimes there's a project that belongs to the engineering department and nobody else needs to be involved. Stuff that security does isn't something that other people need to be involved with. These departmental responsibilities are distinct from one another, but they remain one crew, right? We're one crew, one identity. All of those different projects, all of those different responsibilities, all of those different tasks are all aligned in one singular unity within the ship, right? Within the organization, within the Pandronian organism. And we're able to, by doing those different parts, we're able to collaborate towards one task, one mission. So when one officer builds physical readiness, the benefit ripples outwards. It starts within his own body, within his own mind, his own emotions, and then ripples out to each other member of the crew, right? When each of us becomes a better version of ourselves, our increased capabilities influence the people around us, because that makes us more reliable, more trustworthy, more capable, and that makes life that much easier, that much better, that much safer for the people around us. When one department trains discipline, the whole starship is sharper. So here's something else to think about. Think of a time when your personal readiness carried over to the crew, either the crew of the ship or to some other member of your inner circle, family member, colleague, or a friend. Something that when you spend time and effort developing increased capability, and your increased capabilities made life that much better, benefited somebody around you. Think about that. Again, you don't have to answer in chat, although I'd be curious to hear. Just give that a thought. Roll that around in your head for a bit. There are some other examples of this kind of thing in Star Trek, which might be useful to think about if we consider them as metaphors for this whole concept. And they relate to different alien beings that have a sense of self that transcends the individual, if that makes sense. You'll see what I mean. So think about the Trill, right? The Trill are a joined species. There's actually two different species that exist in symbiosis with each other. There's the Trill humanoids, like Jadzia, like Esri. And then you have the symbionts, which is a vermiform species native to the same planet. And those symbionts can only live, like it's part of their life cycle that they live inside a humanoid host, like Dax, like Tal, a couple of others that we've encountered over the whole of canon. The vermiform symbiont has a lifespan much, much longer than the humanoid host. So it will have to transfer from one host to the next, carrying a portion of the memories and the personality of the previous hosts to future hosts. And so each joined Trill is then a joined organism that is a combination of not only that humanoid host, but the accumulated memories and personalities of all previous hosts that symbiont has bonded with. So there's an idea. How does that relate to your sense of self in terms of the different parts of your own body, right? Your heritage, the things that you've learned, the people that you grew up with. What have you carried with you from people that you've been in contact with over your life? Another example is the Borg, right? So this also is a sense of self that transcends the individual. So these are individuals that operate independently, but they all are part of a single self. Now, this is a closer analogy for the kinds of colony organisms we have here on Earth, not Portuguese man of war, not corals, not brittle stars, but the more kind of dispersed ones, like an ant colony or like a beehive, where you can look at it that a single ant is the organism, or you can look at it that the entire colony is the organism. And even though they are moving separately and they're living their own lives, they are also part of one big thing, which is the ant colony. And the Borg are kind of like that. Are you like that? Are you part of an organization or an organism that has an aligned, unified vision? Are you one component of a larger machine? And how well do you fit within that machine? And I don't mean just the Dauntless. I could mean your family, your religion, your day job, your sports team, whatever it might be. Are you part of an organism like that, where you are just one component of a larger machine? And maybe you're not part of that machine 24 hours a day, right? Maybe it's only a certain amount of time. Maybe it's only under certain circumstances. But maybe it's helpful to think about yourself in those moments as being part of a larger thing than just yourself, maybe. There's also the idea of the transporter paradox, right? So we've seen multiple occasions of this when an individual is either split or joined with the transporter. I mentioned Tuvix earlier. There's also the Thomas Riker syndrome, where a single individual is split into two different individuals with the transporter. Now, again, this is a sci-fi thing, but is that So is your identity tied not just to the pattern of who you are today, but is it tied to a continuity of yourself over time, right? Can you identify with who you were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, even though that person has the same ID number, has the same legal name, probably, unless you've gotten married. Is that still the same person? That's a useful thing to think about too. Again, I'm not saying that it is or it isn't, but something to consider. That personhood, that legacy of personhood that is you over time. What does that mean? So in other words, the lesson that we get from Star Trek canon is that selfhood, self-identity, doesn't exist in just one place, right? There isn't only one way to think about that. It's always in the interplay between the different parts of an organism or of a system. And mission readiness is our way of living that truth, of thinking about ourselves as multiple component parts operating together in unity, but also distinct from one another in important and practical ways, but not only parts of ourselves, thinking of ourselves as part of a larger unity in which we are our individual selves, distinct component parts of a larger organism. So let's return to the okay, let's just close up, right? Let's finish up. So let's address Bem's fear at the end of the episode. So his concern was that he didn't want to be reassembled, to be split apart and reassembled into something else that wasn't him, right? He was afraid of a discontinuity of self. And I see it that is the danger of neglecting our mission readiness, right? If we neglect our constant striving towards self-improvement, we run the risk of becoming misaligned within ourselves, right? Of losing alignment of ourselves and then losing ourselves in the process, right? That's how you end up with syndromes like dissociation, where you no longer feel like you are part of yourself because you lose a sense of connection and awareness of who you are and when you are. The more you work on building yourself up, the more you become an intentional outcome of your own choices and actions, the more seated you feel within the context of your own physical, mental, and emotional self. So we don't want to be reconstituted. We don't want to lose ourselves. We don't want to become dissociated from our individuality. We want to retain all of those things, that sense of identity, that sense of self. And that allows us then to make intentional choices about what other things we affiliate with, like Starfleet, like the Dauntless, like our religion, our friends, our jobs, etc. Mission readiness isn't three different pursuits, right? It's not three different projects. It's one project that's expressed in three different ways, three different interfaces: mental, physical, and emotional. But every action in one strengthens the whole. And when our parts are aligned, we are whole, right? When those three legs are being strengthened together, we are a unified self. And when we're whole, we're ready for the mission. That wholeness itself is mission readiness, or part of it. Okay, let's see if we have any questions or comments. Okay, that's not today. There we go. Nothing there. Okay. All right. Master Chief Kotza has said that when I tried to play Dungeons and Dragons in my 30s, I realized I have to develop my soft skills and learn to be able to tell stories. It's hard work to support everyone. Yeah, that's an interesting notion. The idea of gaming in general, but D&D in particular, as a way of developing soft skills. This is something that I felt very strongly about when I used to run my my business, where we had a gaming venue, right? The idea was that people would come and play tabletop games in our venue, and we would serve them coffee and sandwiches while they were doing it. Is that we immediately found that most of our customers were people that were socially awkward, right? People who struggle to find social interactions organically, and so they needed to have a substrate, a mechanism, a tool to initiate the social interaction with other people. And tabletop gaming seemed to be a great way to do that, right? Because now you're having a conversation with people, you're getting all of those social hormones, all of that interaction, satisfaction from having a conversation with somebody else across the table from you, but you don't have to sit and think about what to say, right? Because what to say is already encoded into the game that you're playing. If you're playing Magic the Gathering, you're talking about the cards, right? And it doesn't matter that it's not a deep, meaningful, emotional, soul-searching conversation. It's fine. It's okay if your conversation is, I tap 2 mana and cast Lightning Bolt. That's fine. The fact that you're talking to another person and that you're interacting with them, they're understanding you and they're responding, that's enough, right? That's a really good start. D&D takes that to the next level because you don't have all of that stuff automatically encoded with you. It requires a certain degree of imagination, not just from the DM, but from the players as well. You kind of have to think about what you want to do. And there's a collaborative storytelling there, which requires another level of social interaction. So it therefore doesn't surprise me that tabletop role-playing, although we did host that at the gaming venue fairly often, it wasn't as popular as the kinds of tabletop games where that conversation is built in, just because for socially awkward people, taking that extra step to that extra level of sociality can be quite challenging. But just about everybody who was there thought that it was a great idea and they were keen to participate at some point, if not yet. So D&D is a great way of doing that. I agree it can be challenging, especially if you're not used to it, but telling stories is useful. Coming up with interesting ideas and communicating those ideas so that other people can understand them and run with them, and that they can use your concepts to build more creative ideas on top of, etc. It's a useful skill, not only in gaming, but in life, I think. And if you're able to function in some kind of social environment, like a corporate environment or a team, you need to be able to communicate at that level. All right. My yeoman has also put forward a couple of questions. First one, if the pillars, those 3 pillars, mental, physical, emotional, aren't really separate, why do we keep using them at all? The pillars they're kind of like teaching tools, I suppose you could put it that way. But the stations on the starship analogy is great, the 3 different interfaces, because approaching things from a physical point of view requires a very different strategy from approaching things from an emotional point of view, right? The approach to doing it is different. The way that you measure and track your progress is quite different. And although building one helps to strengthen the other, your goal setting, and we did a briefing on goal setting not that long ago, your goal setting for either one is going to be quite different. So it's useful from a practical point of view to think of these things as separate, even if they're not really separate. Okay, next question. What happens if someone is very strong in one pillar but weak in the others? As I said, this has been my experience. And I found that during that time, I was definitely off balance, right? I was not the optimal version of myself. Although I couldn't see it at the time because I was not yet sufficiently emotionally developed, I couldn't see how off balance I was, right? But what that meant at the time was that I was not as strong as I could have been. And it was only when I started to build on those other 2 interfaces, those other 2 pillars, that I started to realize just how weak I'd been, and how much strengthening I still needed. So my recommendation to somebody who finds themselves strong in one pillar but weak in the other 2, just do what you can to try and strengthen those other 2. Even if it seems silly, even if it seems futile, even if you feel like you can't do it, do what you can, take whatever small steps you can, set your goals appropriately, and you'll soon start to see just how big of a gap there might be, and you can start working on closing that gap, because really all 3 are equally important because they're all part of the same system. All right, next. Isn't emotional readiness just mental readiness by another name? Yes and no. Yes, in that they're all part of the same system, but no, in that from a practical point of view, they're quite different in the way we approach them. So mental readiness is about acquisition of skills and being ready to take on challenges from a practical point of view, right? Having the knowledge that you can anticipate any challenge coming up from a direct strategic practical point of view, right? So you know that when you face this situation, you know that you either already know how to solve the problem or that you have the mental tools available to you to solve the problem. The emotional side of things is quite different because that's about regulating your mental state and keeping it optimal for solving the problems, right? So it's managing the environment in which you can create the solutions to your problems. So it's about allowing yourself to become emotionally aroused when you need it, right? Because sometimes that arousal helps you to solve the problem, or it's about managing your arousal and keeping it low when you need a cool head to solve problems. It's about understanding the difference, being able to tell the difference, and knowing how to manipulate that within yourself. So again, quite different things. Not mental is about skills and tools. Emotional is about managing the environment. All right. Next question. If training one pillar always builds the others, does it matter where I start? I would say from that perspective, no, it doesn't really matter. Starting is the most important thing, regardless of which one you start with. I would only caution against building only one pillar and neglecting the other two, just because you'll create a disparity, which then makes you unbalanced. Starting with one and then catching up on the others is fine, because again, you're strengthening the other two every time you work on one of them. So if you work on one, it's going to make it that much easier to build the other two. So starting with one is fine. It doesn't really matter. Whichever one feels right for you is a good place to start, as long as you're using that as a jumping off platform to help build the other two. Another question. So what should I do to work on mission readiness? So first thing I would do is go back and look at all the other videos we've done on this channel about mission readiness, because we've spoken about this at length. The goal setting one is probably a good place to start, because that helps you to get a sense of what can be achieved, or it's more like a process of figuring out what can be achieved, what's a reasonable expectation to hold for yourself, and knowing what it is that matters most, right? What is the right approach to get to where I need to be, or where I want to be, or where I envision myself being, and what steps can I take to get there, right? So the goal setting exercise is a good place to begin. Once you've got your goals in place, then you can start doing the actual work, although setting the goals is part of the work already, so that's a good start. Okay. My yeoman gave me a bunch more questions, but that's just asking about Star Trek canon and Pendronians and Borg. And frankly, I think we have addressed those questions already, so I'm not going to go through that. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to leave you with this thought. Mission readiness isn't about building three separate strengths. It's about becoming whole. When body, mind, and spirit move in alignment, you're not just prepared, you are unshakable. Thank you. That is all for today. You are dismissed. Swart out.